Welcome to VistaTalks, interesting discussions with interesting people from all around the world. Today, it's a real pleasure to be joined by Louise McCormack. Louise is in this interesting and fascinating and fast-moving world of AI when it comes to trustworthy AI and how to bridge that with potentially Louise's decade worth of sort of industry expertise as well. I hope this is going to make for a really interesting conversation, just to maybe get the neurons firing and get us to think about AI ethics and trustworthiness in a slightly different way, and maybe dive a little bit deeper into that topic, because everybody talks about ethics, but what do you mean when you get into the real ethical conversation and the trustworthiness of AI? So let me hand over to Louise. Louise, tell us a little bit about this research that you're involved in and the different aspects that you're focused on right now, because I think it's fascinating.
Yeah, so I'm working in I guess it's a really interesting space right now where you have academics, you have industry, and you have regulators, and they're all working kind of simultaneously. Normally it works where industry gets very, very far ahead, regulators are far ahead, but in this instance, actually, it's academics who are nearly paving the way for pushing this agenda. There's an organization, AI for People Industries, and they have been researching this for a number of years. And following a publication they put out, that's what actually led to the EU's assessment list for trustworthy AI, their principles for trustworthy AI, and the AI Act. And academics are kind of keeping up with this space and kind of driving it on. So I'm kind of working in the space where there's in theory, what's ethics? And there's, okay, well, and then there's the legislation, and then there's okay, but what does that look like for a business? How does a business actually go ahead and do that? And we saw with GDPR, it takes years for that to actually bed in and for people to actually figure out what that looks like. So yeah, it's kind of an exciting space to be in, to be researching it, and kind of, yeah, for academics to be in that space is kind of exciting, I think.
Yeah, and what I love about the research that you're doing, and I know you at the time of recording, you're sort of into your third paper in this area, and there's some great feedback and some great observations coming out of this for industry. Because you're not only sort of stating well, what should you be looking at? How should we measuring it? We'll get into that in a moment. But you're also giving us the sort of industry impacts of that, which I think is really, really helpful. And it's not just this sort of top level, high overview that most people are giving. There's a lot of noise out there about AI. So let's get into it a little bit, because you and I have been sort of trading a few thoughts prior to our recording today about, I voiced the opinion that I've seen a lot of companies, as we all have, rush into AI. They've baked in AI. Every service they have now is AI powered. But there's huge pros and cons to that, isn't there? And while we talk about, in my particular industry, there's a lot of people talk about humans in the loop, but one research company, CSA Research, that I work quite closely with, they're talking about humans at the core. And how that sort of is important when you think about things like regulated industries, ethics, accuracy. We all hear the term hallucinations, but you take it a step further, don't you, when it comes to measuring principles and metrics, and what should we be looking at? So maybe could we pick up the conversation there? I'd be interested to get your thoughts on that starting point.
Yeah, so I guess that you're exactly right. I mean, you see everybody was like a kind of fool's gold rush. Everybody just running to put AI into their product and be like, we have AI, even if it's like some simple machine learning. And of course, the ethics of that needs to be looked at and hasn't been, but it's also risk management. So people were kind of given carte blanche to go and work and take data from anywhere in the business and shove it into a model. And the kind of feedback that we saw from industry was that people didn't understand it. It wasn't even the ethics of people's data. It was that they didn't understand what they were doing. They didn't understand their own data sets. People don't keep documentation on their different features in their data sets. So they were making bad assumptions, and they were basically building models. I heard from a number of different companies where they built models, and the models just didn't work because the data didn't work. So that there was those kinds of problems. And then other associated risks, GDPR risks, real risks around what they were doing. And there's a slowdown now. There feels like there's a slowdown now where people are kind of pulling back and saying, hey, did we even need to do this? Like, was this the pure thing? Like, does this even help our bottom line? Like, there was no prioritization of where to shove AI into the business. There was no really thought about anything. It wasn't just about ethics and, you know, risk for that. It was just a lot of times it was a lot of waste of money. So now people are starting to say, hey, can we pull back? Can we look at where the most benefit can be added to the business with a manageable level of risk? And that's what people are kind of doing now. And they're looking to experts on it, but a lot of times those experts don't exist. You know, the data scientists are the best people. If they can be brought in, they're the best people, because at the center of AI is the data. And that's the, you know, the model is just the model. The model is nothing without the data. So it's the data scientists now that are coming in, and they're the people that need to help pick the metrics for assessment. They're the people that need to help guide the risk, because they understand it far better than even the people that build the models. Yeah, there's a lot of interesting stuff. I could talk a lot about risk. And for each use case, then you would have to look at building out your risk. Every single AI system will have a different level of risk, a different set of metrics to be monitored. Yeah, and it's complicated. I could talk about the classification I was telling you about if you like.
I think that would be interesting. And also maybe you shared recently some great work for the AI for People Institute, and that sort of ethics by design checklist. The questions in there, I think, are very thoughtful, obviously, but I stopped and really considered quite a number of those, because I think it adds to the thinking. It's not top level. It's not, you know, the same questions that you hear all the time. So yeah, please do unpack that for us.
Yeah, I mean, that document, if you're going to read one thing, that's the best thing that someone working in industry that's looking to consider risk and ethics that they can read, because it's just so well thought through. It's so practical. They give resources, they give examples. Like with GDPR, one of the pieces of feedback that came from industry was that within different departments, GDPR could be quite siloed. So within different departments, if somebody was asked to do the DPIA or something like that, that they would have to go and look up what that even means, and they would find examples, and all those resources now exist online for anybody to go and figure out how to do that. But those things don't really exist yet for the AI Act, but this is the first really good thing that I've read. I've read a few things where, you know, you have companies that offer outsourced data protection officers and GDPR training. I've read some of their documents, and I've read a couple of ones that were good, but this is like scientifically good with a really focus on being practical for industry. So yeah, I mean, the document, it's called, it's AI for People Institute, and the document's called their report towards an ethics by design approach for AI. And that ethics by design is a real good area to get into as a starting point for this, for like regulators or companies.
No,
But
I
yeah, like,
appreciate
yeah,
that. Yeah, it really is worth it. And I think you're right by saying, look, if you read anything, if you're going to read anything, read this. And I want to bring the attention, maybe if I can, to something that you and I have discussed before we started recording, because I thought it was a great question. And it's question 12 in this checklist. And I'm going to read it verbatim, if it's okay, just for our audience. So, have you established mechanisms for monitoring AI systems adherence to the requirements and evaluating its performance against them? And the reason why it sounds simple in one hand, but on the other hand, it really gets into this inputs versus outputs, and also how the adherence is being measured. And I think that's a step that's often overlooked. And I know you're looking at inputs at the moment, aren't you, versus outputs? You're having conversations in this space. Could you maybe put a little bit of light into that area for us?
yeah. So it kind of goes back to the data being at the center. And for that third paper that you mentioned, I'm doing all of these industry interviews. So I'm meeting with professionals in this who are working with AI across a number of different functions and industries. And a number of people, I mean, the general consensus for anyone who kind of really knows about this is that they use the phrase garbage in, garbage out. Like that just keeps coming up. People just say, and it's so true. So they put this data in and then it comes out rubbish. But if you can measure the input as well as the output, it's going to work out better for you. So say, for example, this was a specific example someone gave to me yesterday, where she was measuring the input. She had automatic alert setup going into a model on each of the inputs. And if anything deviated, she got an alert. So she got an alert, multiple times where, the data, something drifts. immediately, instead of having to look back and chase back up the channel and see, okay, my model's broken, what happened? She's able to say, this data feeding into my model is broken, my model's broken, and here's how I can fix it. So yeah, measuring what's going into it is the easiest way to measure what's broken, because when you're measuring just those kind of standard model metrics coming out, it's difficult to figure out what's actually happened. And it can take a while for those metrics to go, whereas each individual feature, if you're monitoring those, you have a better chance of kind of managing the risk.
No, I totally agree. It's a really great, insightful point. And when it comes to the area of focus, it brings me nicely onto something I want to ask you about the focus and that spotlight of attention at the moment, not only in inputs and outputs and adherence to the models, but there's also the media involvement here, isn't there? And the impact of that. And we talked earlier, didn't we, about sort of this, you mentioned the term gold rush, there's this sort of AI gold rush that went on, and now maybe the data scientists are getting more involved. So, well, hang on a second, let's just consider this. And I know businesses, many large businesses are saying, well, yeah, it's great and it's in a lot of our services, but how is this impacting the bottom line, for example? But just your thoughts on this sort of media focus, because a lot of the algorithms are a black box. We don't really know what's going on. There doesn't seem to be an awful lot of openness around this. And of course, then you've got people's information and content and data and the ethics of that built into it. But media also hypes it up. I mean, the stock market is just one sort of way of measuring that sort of AI hype, right?
It's an interesting one when we say media, because when we say media, we normally shine a spotlight on the person who wrote the content. So we normally shine the content on the news outlet or whatever. News outlets have their problems, their benefits, but they're generally rooted in some sort of ethics and some sort of transparency. No matter what, they have some sort of principles. That's the people who are producing that kind of news content. But when we kind of hold them responsible, the shift actually needs to move away from the person nearly who's producing the content, because the internet is full of content. The content is all over the internet. There's any amount of content. The person who decides what each person gets to see, that's the person, that's the new media. That's the person responsible for hype. That's the person responsible for radicalization, for anything that's happening right now. You can't go back and say, oh, this little journalist wrote this article. Yeah, but Google said it to everybody. Or TikTok said this user-generated content. You can blame the user who put some stupid thing on the internet. Or you can say, well, actually, what this company has done, like ByteDance, will take our data, profile us, and then decide what each of us will see. And that's like the front page of our newspaper. And I don't know what the front page of your newspaper is, and you don't know what the front page of my newspaper is. And that is genuinely scary. So it's not even the media, because there's any amount of content. There's media content, there's user-generated content. Now we have AI-generated content. It's just the content. It's the person who's looking at you and deciding what to feed you and how to influence you. That's the media that we need to kind of look at, because they're responsible for the hype. They're responsible for pushing you something that scares you, pushing me something that scares me or influences me. So I think like pressure off the people writing the news, because whatever you think about them, their recommender algorithms and the profiling of individuals, that's just far, far, far scarier than a newspaper that has to retract a mistake. Like that's far scarier than a newspaper that gets credit.
Yeah, I mean it's fascinating because obviously Google have done a great job for years at organizing the world's data in quotes, but we still recently, didn't we, OpenAI launching this new search element to ChatGPT, with a GPT search capability. And industry suddenly went, and marketers suddenly went, well, hang on a minute. Google used to give me a list of rankings and I could pay to get mine soar a little bit higher. But now if the AI is going to tell you what's right and what's wrong, and it's going to highlight a particular company, how do I move from search engine optimization to large language model optimization? And I have no idea how to control that, whereas I've got some idea about this search engine optimization world, but large language model optimization and how my content and output relates to that, and whether that makes it into, hypothetically, the front page of the newspaper. How does that get to my consumer? And then if that doesn't get to them, what is getting to them? Because I don't seem to be able to control that anymore. So it's getting quite complex very quickly, isn't it, Louise?
It's interesting because a lot of people will like talk about ChatGPT because they, of course, started this conversation. They offered a consumer product that is so powerful to the market. And that's a separate, I mean, if you want to talk about anything, really, it's the environmental footprint of doing a search, and then you don't really notice there's a data center somewhere that's doing a lot of work and burning a lot of energy to find that answer for you. But besides that, actually OpenAI, they're like a target on their back. So they're getting shot at. But actually, for me, they're not one of the worst companies. There's actually a couple of papers. There's a transparency index that's called the Foundational Model Transparency Index that looks at, I think, about 100 metrics of transparency, very rooted in trustworthy AI. And of course, the place where OpenAI fell down was for the data sources, of course. Famously, that's poorly done by them. But everything else, wasn't actually too bad. And they're getting a lot of the slack. But what about companies like Google? What about companies like Facebook? What about ByteDance? Like those companies are doing, and they're not just responding to searches. Like ChatGPT is somewhat reproducible, and being reproducible is part of accountability. So yeah, it's somewhat reproducible. There's versions of the models that, it's not 100% reproducible, but it's somewhat. But because the people who can decide what we should be afraid of is a recommender algorithm, they're not pushing out data to tell you to be scared of recommender algorithms. They're not pushing that out in the internet. Hey, be really scared. We profile you, and we've decided you should see this for no apparent reason. We might want to do this to people in your country. We don't know. I mean, that's a bit conspiracy, but like the reality is we don't actually know what they want to do or what the motivation. Like in GDPR, part of GDPR is that companies have to tell you why they collect your data and what data they collect and why they do. So if you're on TikTok or any of those platforms, say TikTok, for example, they'll do your face print, your voice print, body type. If you ever open your camera to them, that's just what they're saying, that they're transparent about. They're collecting that stuff. Behavioral data, how you're scrolling, what you're pausing on versus other people. And they decide the comments that you see in order. And that shapes how you take in what they see. But they also decide what specific content you see. And they don't actually say what they're using your data for. So they say, we use it to personalize your newsfeed. To what end? For me, that's not really answering that question. And the legislation in the AI Act is more strict for that. So I think there's going to be some pressure on them to come out and say, specifically, what's the motivation? Like, are we trying to make her happy? Are we trying to keep her on the platform to sell her things? God, I hope that's what it is, but you don't actually know. So I think they're going to have to be more transparent about that type of thing. What's the motivation for deciding what you see? Because search is different. Search is reproducible. It's more consistent. It's the feeding. It's the stuff that we're not even looking for. That's the stuff where we're just being fed. Like I worked in marketing for years. And you know how easy it is to influence people. You show them enough things and they start to think it. Like that's how marketing works. That's how you influence people. And those AIs that are scary. The search ones, of course it needs to be done, but it's not the one that it's getting a lot of airtime already, versus the recommenders.
Yeah, no, thank you for those points. And I think we've seen it, haven't we? I mean, early social media was social graph. I'm connected to you and I'm connected to these people. So we see each other's stuff a bit more. And then TikTok came along and sort of upended everything, and it became more preference led. So you like this, so we'll show you more of this. But then there's that third element that you're describing, which is you're not quite sure why you're being shown something anymore. And the order that you're being shown it is not your decision anymore either. And that's a huge change in a relatively short period of time.
And it doesn't even have to be intentional. Like there's a lot of papers on these rabbit holes, and like even places like YouTube and certainly don't intend, like I imagine they don't intend to make young men angry, but we're seeing this deviation. So like, I know someone who, saw her son's recommended stuff, and she was like, oh, that's what you're being recommended, and was worried, was like, oh my God, like what else is he being recommended? Like if you're seeing videos like if you got a son or a young man who's looking at videos that are titled woman gets humbled, like that is just horrible. Like it's a horrible thing to think, oh, that's what you're seeing, like that's how your reality of the world is being shaped. You're on that side of the algorithm. Oh, this is going to turn you into this type of person who thinks these kinds of things. And for the first time, we see this huge deviation in political views. In guys, even in Ireland, ages of like 20 to 25, their politics are starting to deviate massively from young women in the same age group. And we never really seen that before, because normally the views have been pretty consistent by gender, but those kind of AI systems, they have a huge role to play in what's happening in those kinds of things. We look at what happened in Ireland, in Limerick City there a couple of months back. Well, the decision was made a couple of months back. A few years ago, a young guy punches someone in the face, and the focus is on how he should be reprimanded, what his punishment should be. But really the focus also could be on what was going on with him that he wanted to hit a woman and beat her unconscious. Like what kind of AI systems are influencing him? Because for sure, people in that demographic are on platforms that are impacting their views and making them think things outside of the societal norms of that they grew up in. And that's where I just think that the conversation isn't happening and needs to happen, because we look at the symptom and we don't say, well, why did he do that? Like what's he, if he's on his phone 3 hours, not him specifically, but a young guy is on his phone for 3 hours a day, like what's happening on that phone? What data is he giving them? What data are they giving him? And what's the motivation for it all? Nobody knows. Like,
yeah. And the ethics and the morals and the AI for good sounds great, but the bottom line is it is impacting people. There have been many studies about this. So you raise some really interesting points. And I suppose to bring it back a little bit to responsible AI, you published recently or posted recently about a report about the Global Index for Responsible AI, and you mentioned that the Netherlands, Germany, and Ireland were sort of pointed out as sort of top 3 countries that were leading the way in responsible AI. Why do you think that's the case? What are Netherlands, Germany, and Ireland getting right or better? I'm sure there's still a lot wrong and there's still a lot to fix. But when you talk about, and I'm going to come on to a follow-up question about what are the key challenges for businesses at the moment, and what can businesses do to help in this, which I know is some of the focus on some of that third paper we've referenced. But when it comes to countries that are maybe doing a little bit better than others, or maybe organizations that are doing a little bit better than others, what are they doing right? What's their approach, Louise? What do you think about? Because there's enough stories about what's going wrong here.
Yeah. I guess in that report, and it is a good report, and they're transparent about what their index kind of measured for. But that report was also published by the Netherlands, but they put us 3rd in Ireland, so we'll take it. But yeah, they gave like different kind of pillars. They were things like government frameworks, the government actions, human rights and AI. So there were like different dimensions that they had selected and kind of scored them. And so, for example, Ireland were doing really well in human rights and AI. There was good regulatory frameworks. There's a very active academic piece in here. I work for, I'm partially funded by ADAPT Research Centre, which is affiliated with a number of universities, including the University of Galway. And there's a lot of people working on this, like in this space. There's also a lot of international cooperation coming from Ireland. So yeah, I think it's exciting. The part of me that looks at how Ireland led the way on the smoking ban, first country to vote in same-sex marriage by popular vote. I think, this could be a place where we become a real thought leader, because I think we're, as a country, in a position to do that. the Netherlands is also, their government is also doing a good job on it. They've also got a lot of transparency stuff going on. And they also have a number of centers over there. I was just over there last weekend. They have these ELSA labs. So ELSA is ethic, legal, social aspects. In the States, I think it's called ethical, legal, social, something else, but essentially that's what it is. So they've got these ELSA labs. I think there are 6 or 7 of them all over the country. So they have a number of researchers working on specific areas. And that's the key part for this, is that every single sector is different. Every single use case is different. And everybody needs to look at this nearly at a sector level and lead the way for their sector. That's kind of where it needs to happen. But that's one thing that the Netherlands are doing very well with their kind of ELSA labs. And Germany, of course, has always been very good with like privacy. That's something that they've always done very well. I think that's why they were up there on that list. I don't necessarily know that they're leading the way for AI specifically, but privacy is so related to it that.
Thank you, Louise. Thanks for taking us through that. And just to think about, I'm going to come on to business now, but the content that all businesses put out is ranked and searched and SEO'd and keyworded and all the meta tags and images and all that good stuff that goes into the written word, video, audio files. And then a lot of companies have come along and scraped all that information and took it to train their models, whether that information was good, bad, or indifferent. And I know a lot of companies are thinking about that. We're seeing, aren't we, a lot of the sort of large LLMs, large AI providers doing content deals now with companies because they maybe took the data in the first place and now realize they need to go back and recompense somebody, or they want access to walled data, walled content that is, I suppose, classified as more reputable content maybe, and they're putting a commercial price on that. And that feeds into this last sort of conversation I'd like to have with you today about business, about challenges, because a lot of people who listen and watch this show think about their content, they think about the challenges of AI. It goes from the obvious, is it going to replace us, to the how can I use this? How can I be this human at the core to make this work better for us? But businesses are having challenges. We're thinking about trustworthiness when it comes to AI, and we're thinking about the trends and where we're going. So could you maybe give us your thoughts on that? Maybe give us some thoughts before we wrap up today, because I know a lot of this is probably in your third paper type of thinking anyway.
Yeah.
But business challenges, how we're measuring that, what should we be thinking about? What are the trends? What are the sort of hot buttons we should be really focused on at the moment, Louise, from your perspective, because you're heavily into this area of research.
I am reading that paper. That paper is not published, but I have, I guess, some trends rather than challenges. Some trends that we're seeing is that data is gold, transparency, it gives trust. So like, for example, if somebody can explain their model, they're getting buy-in at a senior level. So if they can explain what their model does, they're much more likely to get buy-in from execs in the company. Human in the loop is key, just so important. We're seeing a lot of uncertainty around AI legislation. That's obvious. And also now a slowdown and a kind of more of an increased focus on ethical AI. But the challenges for that, there's challenges kind of correspond to all of those. With that focus on ethical AI, people who work in businesses will say that I want to measure fairness of my model, but I can't because, one, there are no metrics that are standard for my industry. I don't even know what a good looks like. I don't even know what metrics to pick. So even if I wanted to audit my model for fairness, I don't know where to start. Secondly, if I did audit my model for, say, like a fairness parity metric, so say like it's a model that says, does this model treat, say like a mortgage model, they give mortgages to people, yes or no. Does this model treat gender balance fairly, for example? Right now, the bank says, well, we never gave the model a gender. The model doesn't need to know the gender. The model will infer the gender. So the person who works there might say, well, I know the model can infer the gender. I want to check if it's fair. So they check if it's fair and they say, okay, hey, the model's not fair, but I can fix that. but it's going to cost you accuracy. It's going to cost you a little percentage of accuracy. Is that okay? Accuracy equals profit for the bank. So they say, no, I don't want to do that. So that's a huge challenge, because even if, because I could say there's a couple of papers which actually propose metrics for that use case. That particular use case is quite well researched, and proposed acceptable trade-offs for fairness, what they think is acceptable. So there's a standard out there that could be followed, but there's no buy-in, because what are they going to do? Like, it's not, why would they do that? Why would they, they're responsible for their shareholders first and foremost. That is what the feeling is. And so that's a huge challenge. You need to decide. In all cases, AI allows us, and a lot of times, to quantify fairness and other things that can be traded off. And someone needs to say, well, how much do we trade off between fairness and privacy and accuracy for this use case? Like, what's good? What does good look like for each use case? And someone needs to decide that, and then they need to go and find a way to make companies actually want to do that, because legally they're not obliged. Right now, a bank just says, well, we didn't give the gender, but are they being audited post result to see if, or the data went in and the data got changed? Is that being audited? In my experience, I don't think that it is. Just whether or not they gave the fields. And that's just not enough with AI, because AI is clever. It's not clever, but it's able to pick it up without knowing it. But there's a number of available, like the paper that the paper I was talking to you about, metrics. That's I'm proposing a classification on metrics that you can use for each of the 7 principles of trustworthy AI. Like within fairness, here's the types of metrics you can use, the classification, within transparency, so on. People, there is a start there, and people, if they really wanted, they could go in and find metrics. But even if they did, they just wouldn't get buy-in to trade that for profit, without being forced to do, which they're not being forced to do under any legislation or any coming legislation. You need that quantifiable benchmark of saying, this is what's acceptable in mortgages, for example, or insurance. But that's not coming anytime soon.
Yeah. And look, it's a great point to end on, because it really is food for thought about where we're going now. And it's interesting, we all started off getting very hyped and very excited, and then we've came to this, okay, well, how's it impacting the bottom line? And then there's well, just because it impacts the bottom line, is it the right thing to do? And then if you don't measure it, or you can't regulate it, or at the moment it's, you hear the term, inverted commas, Wild West. On one hand, it drives innovation. On the other hand, it can be quite damning when you find yourself down various rabbit holes in the very short, distant future. But it's fascinating, and I want to thank you, Louise, for this great work that you're doing. It's not an easy area to focus on. There's lots of moving parts. There's lots of motivations. There's lots of technology behind the curtains. And I want to thank you for the work and for taking time to be on VistaTalks today, because it's been really insightful. I think you've offered some great suggestions, and we'll link up some of those reports as well, because I totally would agree they're a must read if AI, the future of content, the future of what we served up and where we end up is on your mind.
To end on a more positive note, the one thing that I have noticed about AI is that bias already exists in society. Bias already exists. Like the US, they trained their judiciary system to decide the sentence for criminals. And I'm saying, oh, that's biased and that's bad. But they trained it off of people. And the good thing about this is that the bias can then be quantified and fixed. So that is quite exciting in terms of like recruitment AIs. Yes, they're biased, but recruiters are biased. So it's kind of exciting to think that actually, if we're going to use these tools, we can actually fix them, and we can fix some things that already exist. Of course, we can also make them worse, but there's an opportunity there to fix them, I think, as well for a lot of use cases.
Well, thank you for giving us a hopeful note to end on. I really appreciate it, Louise. But I genuinely mean it. I think the work that you're doing is fantastic. I've always been a fan, of course, of the Adapt Center and everything they do. as sort of a think tank and an incubator for great minds. But thanks, Louise, for being on VistaTalks. That kind of brings us to the end of the show. And I hope that people join me back here for some more interesting discussions with interesting people just like Louise in the future. But thanks, Louise. Real pleasure to talk to you today.
Thanks so much. Thank you.